Welcome back to the David Pakman Show. I'm Farron Cousins from Ring of Fire, sitting in for David Pakman today. I started today's show by talking about the state of Florida and the primary victories down there, and Andrew Gillum and Sean Shaw and how great that is. But there's also a lot of horrible right now in the state of Florida, and some of it does go back to that primary. Rick Scott, our current Republican governor, did win the primary on the Republican side, so he is now our Republican nominee for Senate. He is going up against Democratic incumbent Bill Nelson. And believe it or not, one of the biggest issues that these two men will be fighting about in this election coming up, something they've been fighting about for a couple months now, is toxic algae. This story hasn't gotten a ton of national attention. Toxic algae is not exactly a sexy thing that's going to get a ton of clicks or a ton of viewers. But it's a very real issue down here in the state of Florida. Here's what happens, and it's kind of a complicated thing, so I'm going to explain it as simply as possible. Massive lake down in South Florida, Lake Okeechobee. You've probably heard of it. Every year during the rainy season, levels of the lake get too high, so the state comes in and drains the water, two separate lakes, one on each side, one going to the Gulf of Mexico, one going to the Atlantic Ocean. That keeps the lake levels down. What also comes into the lake, in addition to the rainwater, is toxic discharge from sugar mills. See, South Florida, and this is something most people don't know, they don't even think about it. We still have those sugar barons down here in Florida. They control a lot of the politics. They throw around millions upon millions of dollars, and their factories release toxic discharges, and they go directly into Lake Okeechobee. And when you get that sugary toxic discharge, it creates toxic algae. And that's what happens. So when this toxic algae begins blooming in Lake Okeechobee, and then it is funneled out through those lakes to the Gulf and the Atlantic, you end up with toxic algae all along our shorelines, which is what's happening now. Except for this year, that toxic algae met up with a red tide. So we now have this massive combination of red tide and toxic algae that have married together and created this massive amount of toxicity all along Florida's coastlines. If you're not familiar with the state of Florida, you need to understand that our coastlines are our #1 source of revenue as a state. Tourism is the biggest industry here in the state. And yeah, we've got Disney World and Universal and all that. That accounts for a lot. But most people are actually going to the beaches. They're coming for the nice weather. Now they can't do that. Tourism industry is losing a ton of money because of these toxic algae blooms. Property values along the coastline are plummeting, and people are getting sick from doing nothing more than standing on the beach and breathing. Breathing is getting people sick in Florida because of this toxic algae discharge. So there's the backstory. That's why the algae is here. That's how it got so bad. Oh, and by the way, this is worth mentioning. Those two lakes where we funnel all that water out of Lake Okeechobee, there's no life in it. There's no fish. There's no other animals. They're so toxic because of the discharge each year, nothing can live in them. If you took a fish and put it in that river, it would die. So that's how toxic that is. So anyway, bringing it back to the campaign, for several months now, Bill Nelson and Rick Scott have been arguing back and forth about who's to blame, because Bill Nelson takes a lot of money from the sugar barons. The sugar barons are the ones who are creating this toxicity, which breeds the algae. Bad on Nelson. But recently, major story came out talking about how Rick Scott, as governor of Florida, cut $700 million from the budget of state environmental agencies that are actually in charge of monitoring and handling the toxic algae outbreaks. So yes, while it is bad that Nelson is taking money from the people who are creating the problem, Rick Scott took money away from the people who are supposed to fix the problem. $700 million. So Rick Scott stripped away more money than Bill Nelson took from his sugar buddies. And the sugar people are also funding Republicans. They've given money to Rick Scott, so that's also kind of a wash there. So if you had to put a blame percentage on this, you could probably easily throw around about 90% on Rick Scott, if not more, maybe 10% on Bill Nelson. But here's the kicker. Rick Scott, as the two-term governor of the state of Florida, who's hitting the end of his term-limited time here, he's cutting money from environmental protection here in the state of Florida, a state that is 100% dependent upon environmental tourism. And he thinks we don't need to protect this. So can you imagine the kind of damage this man would do in the U.S. Senate? Because at that point, he doesn't just get to make rules for Florida. No, he gets to influence rules for everybody. So any area dependent upon having a clean environment is at risk if Rick Scott goes to the Senate. There is a lot riding on this Senate race down here in the state of Florida. And though I am not a huge Bill Nelson fan, I will tell you that he is 1,000 times better than Rick Scott, who, by the way, happens to be a guy who committed one of the largest Medicaid, Medicare frauds in the history of the federal government, more than $1 billion, only managed to keep himself out of prison by pleading the Fifth Amendment more than 70 times during depositions. It's bad enough that we had him as our governor for 2 terms because the people down here don't really vote in the right way, but it would be even worse to send him to the U.S. Senate where he would team up with Marco Rubio, and God only knows what kind of damage those 2 guys would inflict.